The boardroom gleamed like a showroom for wealth. Mahogany stretched across the long table, its surface polished so perfectly it reflected the glow of recessed lights above. Leather chairs lined the perimeter, each one occupied by people whose suits cost more than a year's rent for most families. The scent of money wasn't in the air. It was in the silence, the postures, the way each person adjusted their cufflinks as though they were setting the tone for billions about to move. At the head of the table stood the bank manager, rehearsed smile fixed in place, a man who had learned long ago that power was best displayed through gestures that seemed routine. A nod here, a pat on the shoulder there, and above all, handshakes. Each one short, firm, and just long enough to remind the recipient of who controlled the room. He started at the far end, gliding down the row of investors. "Thank you for coming," he repeated like a refrain, extending his hand, gripping tightly, then releasing with the same theatrical ease. One after another, the ritual unfolded. Suits leaned forward, smiles matched, eyes sparkled with the kind of excitement only large returns can inspire. When the door opened again, the quiet rhythm broke. Heads turned, subtle yet noticeable. She entered, Dr. Evelyn Carter, Chief Executive Officer of Carter Global Capital. A name that carried weight on Wall Street, a portfolio that could tilt markets, and a reputation earned not through inheritance but through grit, brilliance, and an unrelenting climb up ladders others tried to pull away. Her presence drew eyes instantly, some with respect, others with scrutiny. She walked to her seat without hesitation, movements calm but exact, posture straight, the kind of entrance that said she had stood in rooms like this 1,000 times before and had never once needed permission to belong. Her charcoal gray suit was tailored, the kind of cut that spoke to quiet strength. She set her leather folder on the table, her pen aligned neatly beside it. For a moment, the room seemed to breathe differently. The bank manager's smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, before he smoothed it back into place. Then, as if on cue, he resumed. Another handshake, another nod, another performative exchange that looked polished enough to be scripted. Closer now. He moved down the row, hand extended, voice steady, charm flowing as though it were his currency. He clasped the palm of a tech magnate, then a hedge fund partner, then a Saudi investor. Each gesture followed by the same shallow remark of thanks. Then he reached her. For the briefest instant, his hand hesitated. It slowed, the practiced rhythm interrupted. His eyes darted, too quick to name, but sharp enough to slice. And in that moment, he made a choice. He skipped. His wrist swerved, bypassing Evelyn's waiting hand as though it were never there. His palm landed firmly on the grip of the investor beside her, smile unbroken, words spilling out as though nothing had happened. But something had. The silence that followed wasn't loud, yet it pressed against the walls. It lasted only 2 seconds, maybe 3, but it was enough. Long enough for Evelyn to feel the sting where courtesy should have been. Long enough for others at the table to register it, even if they quickly pretended not to notice. Evelyn did not flinch. Her shoulders remained square, her face an iron mask, her hands resting lightly on the folder before her. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, everything did. Because a handshake wasn't just a greeting. In this room, it was an announcement of who was seen, who was counted, who was deemed worthy of respect. And the refusal to extend it was just as much an announcement. It wasn't the first time she had been dismissed in a space like this. She knew the language of omission well. The skipped introductions, the eyes that slid past her in conversation, the whispers that wrote her presence off as a quota filled rather than a leader earned. She had carried those moments like scars. But this one wasn't going to pass quietly into the ledger of humiliations endured. The bank manager continued without pause, oblivious to the decision forming across the table. Charts lit up the projector, numbers soared across the screen, and his voice carried the weight of certainty. Growth, market dominance, returns that sparkled like jewels. Investors leaned forward, nodding, enchanted by the promise of profit. But for Evelyn, the presentation was already over. Her mind wasn't on the slides, not on the graphs or projections. It was on the truth that had just crystallized in front of her. A single handshake denied could erase $120 billion before the week was done. Because power wasn't in the handshake, it was in the choice of what came after. If you're drawn into this story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Back in the boardroom, Evelyn straightened her tie, the smallest motion but heavy with meaning. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed firmly on the man who had dismissed her. The graphs behind him glowed, the numbers looked dazzling, but none of it mattered anymore. What he didn't know was that his arrogance had already triggered a storm, and soon, the cost of that silence would become unbearable. The bank manager's hand moved on as though nothing had happened, but the moment had already branded itself into the room. Evelyn's face remained unreadable, yet inside, her thoughts pressed like thunder against glass. Because that wasn't just a hand withheld. It was a reminder, a replay of every slight she had ever endured on her way to this table. She had grown up on the west side of Detroit, daughter of a woman who worked nights at a hospital and mornings at a diner, leaving just enough hours in between to sleep on the sofa. Evelyn remembered the sound of her mother's keys hitting the counter after a double shift, the way exhaustion showed in her shoulders, and the whispered promise she gave her daughter again and again. One day, you'll sit in rooms they tried to keep me out of. That promise carried Evelyn through scholarship essays and late nights at the library, through the long bus rides to debate competitions where she was the only black student in a sea of white blazers. She had won her way to Princeton, then Harvard Business School, each acceptance letter a brick laid in the foundation her mother had started with her bare hands. But degrees didn't erase the doubts cast in every room she entered. At her first Wall Street job, she had proposed a restructuring strategy that shaved millions off operating costs. The idea was dismissed when she spoke it, then applauded minutes later when repeated by a white colleague. Evelyn had sat there, pen poised over her notepad, jaw tight, watching applause fall on words that were hers, but delivered by someone they found easier to believe. At a client dinner, she had been introduced not as Evelyn Carter, lead partner on this account, but as Evelyn, one of our diversity hires. The laughter that followed was light, careless, like a joke tossed across a table, but it pressed against her ribs with the weight of generations. She had excused herself, splashing water on her face in the restroom, reminding her reflection that she would not break here. Every skipped introduction, every condescending smile, every whispered remark, they had taught her a language of exclusion. A language she never chose to learn, but had been forced to translate her whole career. And even here, even now, at the peak of her power, CEO of a global capital firm that controlled billions, those same whispers followed her. She could hear them at the table, sliding across polished wood. Two men leaned toward one another, their voices lowered but not enough. Diversity quota, one muttered, a smirk curling at his mouth. His colleague chuckled, jotting something on his notepad as though Evelyn's presence were a line item rather than an empire. The words cut sharper than any number on a chart. Because Evelyn knew what they meant. She had lived long enough in these spaces to recognize the code. They weren't seeing her as the architect of financial empires, the woman who had rescued entire corporations from collapse, the strategist whose name moved stock prices. They were seeing her as a token, a checked box, an outsider politely tolerated in a room built for men who looked like them. Her mother's voice pressed in again, this time steadier than the roar of her thoughts. They will always try to measure you by the weight of your skin. You answer them by the weight of your work. And she had. Every promotion, every merger, every deal signed had been proof. Yet still, proof wasn't enough. Respect was rationed, handed out in fragments, withheld in moments like this one. Evelyn's silence wasn't weakness, it was memory. Every omission today was a mirror of yesterday and of the centuries that came before her. The hand that skipped hers was not just one man's arrogance, it was history condensed into a gesture, a signal that the shadow of exclusion still lingered, even in a room dressed in wealth and power. Across the table, laughter swelled briefly at one of the bank manager's rehearsed jokes. Investors leaned back, polished watches catching the light. To them, the skipped handshake was invisible, insignificant. But to Evelyn, it was everything. Because in her chest, where others saw quiet, she felt the fire of all those who had been skipped, silenced, and erased before her. The bank manager droned on about market share, voice swelling with pride, but Evelyn's mind replayed that moment, slow and deliberate. The eyes that darted, the hand that veered, the smile that never faltered, as though courtesy itself could be denied without consequence. That 1 second stretched across time. It wasn't just a handshake. It was her father barred from a job interview he was qualified for. It was her grandmother ushered to the back of a bus. It was her ancestors shut out of rooms where decisions about their lives were made. Her jaw remained relaxed. Her pen still lay untouched. But beneath that calm exterior, she gathered the weight of it all and carried it forward. Because the truth was simple. That skipped handshake was centuries condensed into seconds. The click of a remote pierced the air. The bank manager dimmed the lights, and the projector whirred to life, splashing charts and graphs across a towering screen. Bright lines climbed upward, bars soared, and numbers swelled into billions. The room shifted its focus instantly, every eye drawn to the promises glowing in blue and white. This, the manager began, voice smooth and steady, is the future of global banking. His tone was polished, the cadence of a man who had delivered the same speech dozens of times. He moved across the floor like an actor who knew every mark. With one hand, he gestured to rising graphs. With the other, he reinforced his claims with open palms, the body language of confidence. The investors leaned forward. Some adjusted their glasses, others scribbled notes, their attention fastened on the slides. Market dominance, international expansion, a footprint stretching across continents, each phrase rolled out like gold. But at the center of the table, Evelyn sat motionless. Her hands rested lightly on her folder, her pen still aligned where she had placed it. She gave nothing to the room. No nod, no scribbled notes, no gesture of agreement. Silence surrounded her like a shield. On the surface, she looked engaged, her eyes faced forward, her posture erect. Yet she was not listening. Not anymore. Because for her, the presentation had ended before it began. The refusal to shake her hand had already stripped the pitch of its weight. Every projection on the screen, every figure touted as triumph, had been hollowed out the moment respect was denied. Numbers meant nothing without dignity, and in that room, dignity had been rationed, granted to others, withheld from her. Still, she watched. She always watched. Her silence wasn't absence, it was observation. The manager's voice rose with enthusiasm. We expect a 40% increase in market share within 3 years. Expansion into Asia will position us as the undisputed leader in this space. With your partnership, we will redefine the future of air travel finance. The words hung like polished ornaments, bright but weightless. Around the table, murmurs of approval rippled. One investor whispered, "Impressive numbers." Another responded with, "This is groundbreaking." Their nods, their eager scribbles were a chorus of agreement. But Evelyn saw past the dazzle. She noticed how his gaze skipped her as he scanned the room for reaction. She caught the half-second glance at her notes, the quick dismissal, the way his eyes darted toward the investor beside her, as though only their response carried value. The omission was subtle, but in spaces like this, subtlety spoke louder than words. Her mind turned over each detail, the skipped handshake, the whisper of diversity quota, the glances that slid past, every moment stacked like kindling, waiting for the strike of a match. And still, her face betrayed nothing. The manager pressed a button, and another slide bloomed onto the screen. A map dotted with glowing markers, each one representing expansion into a new city. With Carter Global Capital's investment, this trajectory becomes unstoppable, he declared. It was the first time he spoke her company's name, and yet even in that acknowledgement, he avoided her eyes, as if naming her firm was necessary for the numbers, but recognizing her presence was optional. The irony was sharp. Everyone in that room knew the truth. Without Carter Global's support, the projections collapsed. His dazzling graphs, his glowing forecasts, they were castles built on sand. Evelyn could remove the foundation with one decision. But she didn't remind him. Not yet. Her silence pressed heavier with each passing slide. And though the investors didn't notice, one or two began to shift uncomfortably, glancing at her from the corners of their eyes. They could sense something in the air, even if they didn't know what it was. The manager, oblivious, drove forward. Together, we will capture the future. Together, we will lead this industry into a new era. The word together echoed across the table. Evelyn almost smiled at the contradiction. Together implied inclusion, partnership, recognition. Yet just minutes earlier, the man who now preached unity had refused to extend even the most basic gesture of acknowledgement. She leaned back slightly, her hands still. Beneath that composed exterior, her resolve solidified, not in anger, but in clarity. Respect denied would not go unanswered. The investors clapped politely as the manager wrapped up, their approval circling the room like currency. He straightened, smug satisfaction etched into his expression, confident he had secured their belief. But Evelyn's gaze never left him. He didn't know it yet, but the silence he dismissed was the silence that would undo him. The restaurant was quieter than the boardroom had been, yet Evelyn carried the weight of that silence with her. Soft amber lights glowed over polished tables, crystal glasses caught the reflections, and the hum of conversation floated gently across the room. It was a place designed for comfort, but comfort never came easy after a day like this. Across from her sat Simone Carter, blazer still crisp from a long day at the office, laptop bag tucked neatly at her side. She had her mother's eyes, the same steady gaze that could disarm a room. But in her, it carried an edge, sharpened by a new generation's refusal to swallow disrespect. Simone studied her mother for a moment, reading the tension in her shoulders, the way Evelyn's fork hovered over her plate without movement. "Something happened," she said quietly. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She set her fork down, folded her hands on the table, and drew in a breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, but the words carried the sting of iron. "He didn't shake my hand." Simone's brow furrowed. She leaned back, her jaw tightening as if the room had suddenly shifted around her. "The manager?" Evelyn gave a single nod. Nothing more was needed. For a beat, the clink of glassware and the murmur of other diners filled the space between them. Then, Simone's lips parted, her voice low and controlled, the kind of tone that carried fury without raising volume. "They think they erased you. They just erased their future." Her words landed heavy, not as comfort, but as a vow. Evelyn watched her daughter, pride and sorrow intermingling in her chest. She remembered the nights she had come home late from Wall Street, exhausted but unwilling to show it, only to find Simone waiting at the kitchen table with homework spread out, asking questions about compound interest before bedtime. She had always known her daughter was watching, not just the successes, but the silences. And now Simone spoke like someone who had grown up tracing the scars her mother never said aloud. "They've been doing it my whole life too," Simone continued, her eyes fixed on her mother. "Meetings where I'm the youngest in the room, the only black woman at the table, and the first assumption is that I'm someone's assistant, not the analyst, not the strategist. Certainly not the one with the numbers that actually make sense." Evelyn reached for her glass, lifted it slowly, then set it back down. Her silence wasn't dismissal, it was recognition. Simone pressed on, voice steady but alive with heat. "What they don't understand is that every time they do this, they think they're diminishing us. But all they're doing is giving us more proof of why they can't lead the future." The words echoed the very thought that had formed in Evelyn's mind back in the boardroom. Respect denied was more than insult. It was evidence. The waiter appeared briefly, placing plates on the table. Neither mother nor daughter acknowledged him beyond a polite nod. The conversation was too sharp, too heavy to break. Evelyn finally spoke again, her tone softer, reflective. "You know, when I was your age, I thought if I just worked harder, if I proved myself over and over, the doors would stay open. That's what your grandmother told me. But it doesn't matter how many billions you manage, there will always be someone who thinks your hand isn't worth touching." Simone's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "Then we make sure they learn what that costs." The fire in her words stirred something inside Evelyn. It was a mirror of her own resolve, but stripped of restraint. Generational strength sharpened by generational anger. Evelyn had learned to endure in silence, but Simone refused silence as a solution. Across the room, a couple laughed loudly over a bottle of wine, but at their table, the mood stayed firm, unshaken. Evelyn allowed herself a faint smile, almost invisible. She had built an empire through endurance. Her daughter was ready to defend it with defiance. The skipped handshake had not erased her. It had multiplied her strength across generations. Evelyn lifted her fork again, finally taking a bite, her face composed. Simone leaned in slightly, her voice low but unyielding. "They'll remember today as the day they underestimated the wrong woman." Evelyn's eyes met hers, steady as stone. And in that unspoken moment, mother and daughter shared the same truth. The insult in that boardroom was not the end of something. It was the beginning. The next morning, The city skyline stretched beyond Evelyn's office windows, a grid of glass and steel shimmering against the light. From this height, everything looked orderly, contained. But Evelyn knew better. Below, the currents of money, power, and prejudice ran wild, and she had learned how to bend them to her will. She sat at her desk, a leather-bound folder open, rows of figures glowing on the screen before her. To anyone else, they were just numbers. Quarterly reports, capital commitments, pending loans. To Evelyn, they were threads in a web, each one connected to Carter Global Capital. And at the center of that web was her hand. The bank that had dismissed her the night before depended on those threads more than they realized. Carter Global wasn't just a partner. It was the anchor to billions of dollars in liquidity. Whole sections of their expansion plan relied on her firm's continued support. Without it, their gleaming projections collapsed into dust. She tapped her pen lightly against the folder, each click a mark of patience. Rage would have been too easy, too visible. That wasn't how she fought. Her power had never been in outbursts. It was in silence, in the pauses where others underestimated her. One phone call, one withheld signature, one word carried to the right ear, and the $120 billion they were counting on would vanish from under their feet. And she was already preparing to make that call. Her strategy was not born in that boardroom. It had been forged long before, in the years of being dismissed, ignored, erased. She had carried each slight with her, not as wounds, but as weapons to sharpen. This wasn't the first insult, but it would be the last that passed unanswered. Her eyes drifted from the numbers to the framed photograph on her desk. It was faded around the edges, but the image remained strong. Her mother in a plain uniform, apron still tied from a diner shift, arms wrapped around a young Evelyn who clutched a second-hand textbook like it was treasure. She could almost hear her mother's voice, steady and unyielding. When they shut the door, build your own. That sentence had carried Evelyn through every locked gate and cold reception. She had built her own, brick by brick, deal by deal, until she no longer needed permission to sit in their rooms. Yet here she was, reminded that even after all she had built, someone still believed they could close a door in her face with a single, skipped handshake. She leaned back in her chair, her mind sharpening around the truth. Respect wasn't a courtesy to her. It was the price of admission. And the bank had just defaulted on that price. The phone on her desk glowed softly, a row of contacts waiting. Each name represented alliances she had nurtured, investors who trusted her judgment, leaders who understood that Evelyn Carter's silence was never emptiness. It was strategy. She didn't dial yet. Timing mattered. A storm wasn't unleashed all at once. It gathered first, quietly, until the weight of it became impossible to ignore. She would let the bank present their rosy forecasts a little longer, let them bask in the glow of projections built on her firm's support. Then she would move, and when she did, the collapse would feel instant. Outside her office, the city pulsed with the noise of horns and footsteps, but inside, the quiet was absolute. It was the quiet of a storm still gathering, the quiet of a decision that would soon roar through markets and leave a trail of disbelief. Evelyn closed the folder, her hand resting firmly on its leather cover. She thought again of her mother's words. When they shut the door, build your own. This time, she added her own ending. And when they try to shut me out of mine, I'll bring down the whole house they built on arrogance. The storm was ready. All it needed was her signal. Back in the boardroom, the air carried on as though nothing unusual had occurred. The bank manager's voice filled the space, gliding from one projection to the next. His slides promised expansion, dominance, inevitability. To most in the room it was business as usual, but not everyone had missed it. When his hand had bypassed Evelyn's, a ripple had passed across the table, barely visible but real. Eyes flicked quickly, then darted away. A pause too long in note-taking. A shift in posture. Small acknowledgments that proved they had seen, though none would admit it aloud. Two men at the far end exchanged a glance, one raising his brow, the other pressing his lips into a thin line before looking back at the glowing charts. Their pens scratched again, as though scribbling numbers could erase the insult. Another investor leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflink, choosing the performance of indifference rather than the discomfort of recognition. And then there was James Harrington, a venture capitalist with a reputation for backing innovators others ignored. Harrington's presence at the table carried weight. He had weathered his own dismissals early in his career, though privilege had eventually shielded him from the worst of it. His eyes had caught the moment when the handshake skipped, his jaw had tightened, and for the briefest second, his gaze locked with Evelyn's. It wasn't a smile, it wasn't a frown, just a nod, small, restrained, nearly invisible. But it was enough to say, "I saw." Evelyn returned nothing. She had long since learned that recognition without action was air. The bank manager pressed forward. "With your support, our reach across Asia will eclipse competitors in under 3 years." His voice swelled with certainty. A few chuckles rose around the table, amusement at his enthusiasm. Yet Evelyn remained still, her silence wrapping her like armor. In that silence, the real story unfolded. Because silence wasn't neutral. Silence was choice. Silence was survival for some, comfort for others. The room had witnessed a public dismissal and chosen to mute it, as though acknowledgement would stain their own suits, as though respect for her was optional. Complicity didn't always arrive dressed in malice. More often it arrived in folded hands, in eyes that looked away, in lips that stayed pressed shut when truth pressed against them. Maya's voice lingered here. The silence of witnesses is what keeps racism breathing. Evelyn knew this well. She had lived it in boardrooms across her career. Partners who shifted uncomfortably but never spoke. Colleagues who later confessed privately that they didn't like how that looked, yet had said nothing in the moment. Each silence was a reminder that injustice rarely survives because of the boldness of the few. It survives because of the cowardice of the many. Harrington's nod was a gesture, but it was not intervention. It was an acknowledgement without cost, a safe signal that spared him from risk. And though Evelyn recognized the human impulse in it, she also recognized its limits. A nod would not change the trajectory of what came next. The projector shifted again, splashing another slide onto the screen. Numbers climbed, profits gleamed, applause trickled softly across the table. The manager clasped his hands together as though awaiting praise. Evelyn did not move. Her silence was not complicity. Her silence was memory, patience, and preparation. While others muted their discomfort to protect their comfort, she gathered it. She stored it, every omission and every glance, stacking them like evidence for the verdict she would soon deliver. Around her, the witnesses returned to their papers, their tablets, their notes. The meeting went on. But beneath the polished surface, the fracture lingered, widening with each denial, each avoidance, each silence. And Evelyn sat at its center, unbothered by the weight of their inaction. Because she knew what they had not yet realized. Silence might protect them now, but soon it would expose them all. The city outside Evelyn's office pulsed with its usual rhythm. Horns, sirens, the murmur of endless motion. But inside her suite, the air was still, heavy with a different kind of movement. The turning of gears only she could set in motion. Her phone rested on the desk. Screen glowing faintly with a list of contacts. Each name represented billions of dollars in trust. Built not by inheritance, but by decades of unflinching work. She didn't rush. She had no need to. Her strength was not in speed, but in precision. One call, that was all it would take to start. She pressed the line through to her managing director. The conversation was brief, stripped of explanation. Freeze the pipeline on the Delta expansion portfolio. No approvals, move forward until further notice. A pause on the other end, then a careful, understood. The first domino tilted. She called her operations chief next. Hold the disbursements for their European credit facility. I'll review it personally. Another pause, then compliance. Her words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of empires. Every instruction slowed the blood flow of the bank that had dismissed her, cutting circulation in places only she knew how to reach. And she wasn't finished. Within the hour, discreet messages were passed to trusted allies in the market. Nothing elaborate, just signals. Subtle enough to avoid headlines, but strong enough to stir questions. Phrases like reconsidering commitments and reviewing exposure began floating through private channels. The whispers spread quickly, because when Carter Global shifted, the ground beneath Wall Street shifted with it. By midday, phones buzzed in brokerage houses and hedge funds across the city. Traders asked one another why Carter Global seemed hesitant. Analysts scribbled new notes into their reports. Concern sharpened in quiet corners of the market, the kind that never made it into press releases but always found its way into balance sheets. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her eyes steady, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She wasn't celebrating, she wasn't even angry. This was not revenge, it was consequence. Her decision was anchored in one truth. Respect cannot be negotiated. It is the price of admission, and the bank had refused to pay. She thought again of the moment in the boardroom, the skipped handshake, the glance that dismissed her as though she were invisible. It wasn't new. It was the same dismissal her daughter endured in her own meetings, the same her mother had endured when managers called her girl instead of her name. That gesture was history condensed, arrogance crystallized, and now it carried a cost. By evening, the news began to slip into wider circles. Journalists with sources in finance whispered of hesitation from Carter Global. Blogs picked up fragments. Unconfirmed reports suggest Carter Global Capital is reviewing its $120 commitment. The story was still forming, still shadowed in speculation, but the effect was immediate. Traders adjusted portfolios. Calls were made in a flurry to the bank's headquarters. Executives scrambled to assure their clients that all was stable, even as their own hands shook beneath the table. Evelyn watched it all unfold with the composure of someone who had seen storms before and learned not to flinch. Her silence was deliberate. She didn't need to explain. In her world, silence itself was a message. And right now, that message was deafening. Across town, the bank manager who had skipped her hand finally heard the whispers. At first, he brushed them off, confident in his numbers, certain of his projections. But as the hours passed and the calls multiplied, confidence thinned. The graphs he had paraded before investors that morning began to feel less like promises, and more like lies waiting to be exposed. Evelyn closed her office window blinds as night settled over the city. The quiet was almost soothing. She thought again of her mother's voice. When they shut the door, build your own. She had built her own, and now she was proving another truth. When they dared to dismiss her in the house she had built, she could bring the whole roof down. The first move had been made, and the storm was no longer gathering, it had begun. By morning, the whispers had grown teeth. Carter Global Capital was reconsidering. That word alone, dropped into financial circles, carried more weight than any press release. It slipped into trading floors, echoed in investment calls, and rippled across portfolios like a crack spreading through glass. At the bank's headquarters, phones rang without pause. Assistants darted between offices carrying hastily scribbled notes. The board convened in an emergency meeting, their polished calm replaced by anxious gestures and raised voices. "We need clarity," one director demanded, sweat beading at his temple. "Why is Carter Global freezing approvals? Someone pick up the phone and get me Evelyn Carter directly." But Evelyn didn't take their calls. Instead, she let the silence build. And silence in the markets is poison. Within hours, speculation outpaced fact. Traders dumped shares, unwilling to gamble on uncertainty. The bank's stock dipped, at first by a fraction, then by whole percentage points. Headlines followed the plunge, each one feeding the next. Carter Global pulling out, 2020 goals partnership in jeopardy. On cable business networks, analysts dissected the rumor with furrowed brows. If true, this would be catastrophic, one said. Their entire international expansion model hinges on Carter Global's capital pipeline. Without it, the numbers don't work. Behind the scenes, the manager who had skipped Evelyn's hand was thrust into the center. Reporters clamored for comment, flashing cameras catching his stiff posture as he slipped into a black car outside the bank. "Is it true Carter Global is pulling out?" one shouted. "What does this mean for your shareholders?" another pressed. He kept his smile thin, his words rehearsed. "We remain in strong partnership discussions. Nothing has changed." But everything had changed. Inside, his staff pored over the slides he had presented just days earlier, realizing the projections were now worthless without Carter Global's support. Graphs that had soared upward now looked like cliffs about to collapse. The same investors who had clapped politely in that boardroom were now calling, angry and impatient, demanding answers. The arrogance that once buoyed him began to falter. His confidence shrank under the weight of questions he couldn't answer, because the truth was simple. His entire empire of promises had been built on a foundation Evelyn Carter had already begun to withdraw. And she did not need to raise her voice to prove it. While the bank scrambled, Evelyn sat in her office, calm and unshaken. Her phone remained silent by choice, her hands folded loosely as she looked out across the city skyline. To her staff, she gave no fiery speeches, no visible displays of anger or triumph. She simply carried on with the stillness of someone who knew power was not in reaction but in control. Her dignity was the loudest voice in the room, even in her absence. At one point, her assistant entered with a stack of press clippings. Evelyn glanced at the headlines, then set them aside without a word. She had no need to bask in the spectacle. The humiliation unfolding at the bank was not for her entertainment. It was the consequence of their arrogance. Meanwhile, panic deepened downtown. Traders refreshed their screens obsessively as the stock dipped further, wiping billions from the bank's valuation in a single day. Investors who had once laughed easily at dinners now whispered in corridors, some already drafting exit strategies. In the boardroom where the slight had occurred, the atmosphere was unrecognizable. Gone was the confidence, the polished ease. In its place were raised voices, slammed folders, and the suffocating realization that one man's arrogance had triggered a crisis. "Fix this," one executive barked. "We need to reassure the markets," another insisted. They issued press statements, each one more desperate than the last. The partnership remains strong. Carter Global continues to support our growth. But every sentence rang hollow without Evelyn's confirmation. She gave none. The manager, who once skipped her hand as though she were invisible, now found himself unable to escape the spotlight. His face appeared on news tickers, his name dragged into speculation, his credibility shredded by silence he couldn't control. The same arrogance that made him dismiss her was now the noose tightening around his career. And Evelyn? She remained composed. The calm in her posture spoke volumes. She didn't need to shout to dismantle a system that had tried to erase her. All she needed was her stillness, her refusal to bow to disrespect, and the discipline to let silence speak louder than defense. By evening, the market had closed with the bank's shares at their lowest point in a decade. Commentators called it a confidence crisis, but Evelyn knew it was more than that. It was a reckoning. Because respect is not a courtesy. It is the foundation of power, and once that foundation cracks, collapse is not a question of if. It is a matter of when. The headlines by the end of the week painted the contrast as clearly as numbers on a balance sheet. On one side stood the bank, its reputation shredded, its leadership mocked for arrogance disguised as confidence. On the other stood Evelyn Carter, silent yet commanding, her refusal to answer questions louder than any press conference could have been. Public humiliation clung to the bank like smoke after a fire. Analysts described their projections as untenable without Carter Global. Investors spoke openly about mismanagement at the highest level. Behind closed doors, executives scrambled to save their careers, pointing fingers at one another, but the truth followed them everywhere. One act of dismissal had exposed everything fragile about their empire. Evelyn, meanwhile, did not dwell there. Quiet vengeance had never been her goal. She did not need to sit among their ruins to feel satisfaction. Her focus had already shifted forward, toward spaces where dignity was not rationed, where respect was woven into the foundation of the partnership. Her first move was quiet. Conversations with leaders of institutions that had long sought her trust, but unlike the bank, had extended genuine respect in every interaction. Universities seeking to fund scholarships for first-generation students. Credit unions with histories of inclusion rather than exclusion. Private equity firms led by executives who had stood shoulder to shoulder with her during earlier battles. At a meeting in a sunlit conference room overlooking the Hudson, Evelyn outlined her vision for a new partnership, one that would not simply chase profit, but would build structures that lasted. Capital can expand markets, she said evenly, but respect builds longevity. Without it, growth collapses on itself. The room agreed, not just with nods but with action. Commitments followed. New contracts began to form. And with each signature, Evelyn wasn't just securing financial growth, she was rewriting the unspoken rules of who held authority in these rooms. That evening, she sat once more across from Simone at dinner, this time with a different weight in her shoulders. Not the heaviness of insult, but the steadiness of resolve fulfilled. "You didn't just walk away," Simone told her, eyes bright with both admiration and recognition. "You rewrote the rules." Evelyn allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Her daughter's words weren't flattery, they were truth. For decades, the burden had been survival, proving again and again that she deserved to be in the room. But this moment wasn't about survival. It was about defining the terms of respect so clearly that no one could ever mistake them again. The ripples stretched beyond her. Within weeks, stories began circulating in the community of Black entrepreneurs across the country. Quiet conversations in Atlanta, Detroit, and Los Angeles carried her name. Evelyn Carter pulled $120 billion because a man wouldn't shake her hand. The statement was simple, yet it carried the weight of defiance, proof that silence need not mean surrender. Young founders repeated it to one another as inspiration. Established business leaders cited it in interviews, calling it a reminder that wealth without dignity was poverty in disguise. Even those outside finance recognized the symbolism. One gesture denied, answered by billions redirected. And in that recognition, Evelyn's act became larger than herself. For every Black professional who had endured a skipped introduction, a stolen idea, or a whisper of quota, her refusal to let this slight pass unanswered was a victory. It was a reminder that endurance had value, but so did action. That patience could become power when timed correctly. The bank continued its spiral, but Evelyn never mentioned their name again. She didn't need to. Their downfall had already entered the market's memory. What mattered now was the foundation she was building with partners who valued both her intellect and her presence. At her office, a fresh contract sat waiting for her signature. The ink not yet dry. She looked out the window, the skyline rising tall, and thought of her mother's voice one more time. When they shut the door, build your own. She had built her own, and by closing theirs, she had given others the courage to build theirs too. The skipped handshake had not erased her. It had magnified her voice into an echo carried far beyond that single boardroom. The story of Evelyn Carter did not end in that boardroom. In truth, it was never about one meeting, one bank, or even one man who refused to extend his hand. It was about the system that taught him he could. A system that has thrived on omission, on the skipped greeting, the overlooked introduction, the quiet whisper that reduces brilliance to a statistic. In that silence, many would have chosen to bury the insult. To shrug, to swallow it, to press forward without response. But Evelyn understood something deeper. Silence when chosen is not weakness. It can be strategy, it can be weapon. A handshake withheld revealed more than arrogance, it revealed fragility. Fragility in the bank's foundation, fragility in its leadership, fragility in the very belief that exclusion can coexist with progress. That moment exposed how brittle the edifice of power truly is when respect is denied. And Evelyn's silence? It became the answer. Not the silence of surrender, but the silence of calculation. Her stillness was not emptiness, it was decision. By choosing not to lash out, not to confront with words in that instant, she preserved the strength of a different strike. The call she made later, the freeze she ordered, the pause that unraveled billions. That was the voice she chose. Her dignity became her weapon. Because in a world where Black women in power are still questioned, still diminished, still told with subtlety that they do not belong, the most devastating reply is to act as though you never needed their permission to begin with. The collapse of the bank was not only financial, it was moral. It was a public reminder that arrogance disguised as confidence and racism disguised as oversight can carry costs no institution can afford. It proved what many already knew, but too few dared to say. Racism, in corporate America, is not always loud, not always shouted. Sometimes it hides in the omissions, the handshake not offered, the eye contact avoided, the voice dismissed. But those omissions are no less violent. They chip away at dignity in ways that echo across lifetimes. Evelyn chose to answer omission with removal. She pulled not just her hand back, but her billions. She redirected her power toward partnerships that saw her, that valued her, that understood respect as non-negotiable. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching, especially those who look like her, that there is no requirement to remain where you are diminished. Her daughter Simone saw it, and through her, the next generation carried it forward. Black entrepreneurs across the country saw it, and through them, the echo widened. Communities whispered her story, not as gossip, but as gospel. Dignity is not only worth defending, it is priceless. Evelyn never raised her voice. She never needed to. Power does not always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly, hands folded, waiting until the weight of action crushes arrogance into dust. That is the lesson of this story. That is the echo left behind. The skipped handshake was never just about her. It was about centuries condensed into seconds, answered with billions that rewrote the terms of the deal. And so the reflection remains clear. Racism, no matter how subtle, no matter how small it appears to those who don't carry its weight, cannot stand against dignity. Dignity dismantles it every time. And now, let's turn this to you. What would you have done if you were Dr. Evelyn Carter? Drop your thoughts below, share your country flag, and don't forget to subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, because stories like this remind us dignity is priceless.